it speaks to the willingness of the global north to meet climate finance commitments under the Paris Agreement. Decarbonizing South Africa, which is a very carbon-intensive electricity producer, is also a step in the right direction. It appears to provide for a just transition, which would hopefully translate into green jobs and support for workers and communities. It also includes grants, concessional loans, and other risk-sharing instruments, which are crucial to de-risk investments, but also to encourage much-needed private sector participation in climate finance. What is not clear, however, is what that disaggregation looks like. What we have seen in the past in terms of climate finance that's directed to developing nations is a huge chunk of it comes in the form of loans, about a little over 80%. And the problem with that kind of split is, of course, it doesn't do a good job of accounting for climate justice in the context of historical responsibilities. But it also, burdens countries with additional debt. I think the other thing that is not clear specifically in the case of South Africa is whether that is actually a sufficient amount to not only phase out coal, but also to address other challenges. With that being said, the outcomes for Africa really just come down to a couple of things: sufficient climate finance, emission reduction, particularly by the global north. We need to see more ambitious targets, tighter timelines, considering that Africa contributes about 2 to 3% of global emissions.
I think it's great you mentioned that African countries contribute the least to climate change, but bear the hardest hit. The British broadcaster Dave Attenborough said at COP26, this is a story of inequality as well as instability. So how would African countries balance economic growth and reaching climate change goals?
So the question of how Africa can balance economic growth and climate change really calls for a very compassionate understanding of Africa's unique circumstances. It bears the most impact, but it is also now required to pursue low carbon pathways for sustainable development. And that's very expensive, right? In a nutshell, Africa's capacity to achieve these goals is largely, almost entirely dependent on the actions of the global north, who bear the historical responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. An aggressive phasing out of fossil fuels and climate and science-based emissions, because invariably the continent will emit a certain amount of emissions to build out infrastructure, to guarantee energy access, including using natural gas as a transition fuel. And lastly, of course, is the need for an ecosystem that can guarantee meaningful outcomes for climate change and human progress.
I think one important topic is the gender role in this movement. So how could African countries get more women and young generation involved in sustainability and climate change?
The fact that climate change impact is not proportionately distributed amongst genders, right? When you look at household energy access in rural and peri-urban areas, the health and education outcomes, say, for women and girls are less favorable because they are more likely to be the ones looking for firewood, walking long distances to fetch water. So they're not just proximate to the problems, but if they are well engaged, they are also a very resourceful source of solutions that actually work for climate change and sustainable development. And from a policy perspective, and in terms of tapping into the potential of women and youth, it means, gender and social policy, including for youth, that supports the inclusion and active participation of youth, of women in policymaking, in politics, in leadership, in business, in professional development.